Hello and welcome to the first chapter of the course. As the title already suggests, in this chapter we will be looking at Black's symmetrical reply to our first move d4, which is the move d5. So Black places a pawn in the center just like White does, and from here on we will see how the game can develop in the middle game. So knight f3. This is the proposed development in this opening course. It's a very simple and straightforward development for White, which primarily aims to develop the king side by playing the move e3. Then the bishop will come to e2, and White will castle to the king side, ensuring that the king is safe and well taken care of. A second point of this development for White is the very good control over the central e5 square. So already on move 2, Black has a different choice of moves, even though the vast majority of them will transpose to something that we will look at a bit later on. In other words, the positions that can arise from moves that I will mention right now will be analyzed a bit later in this chapter. So the most popular moves by far are the knight moves for Black, the development of the knights, knight f6, following the symmetry, or knight c6, which is common because, as we already know, when we know this from probably ever since we have learned chess, is that normally knights should be developed before bishops. Therefore, it's not surprising that these two knight moves are the most popular choices. This, however, doesn't mean that Black cannot play other moves, and very often Black will play other moves. However, they will not really take us unprepared because we will take a look at all of them. So to mention some of the transpositions from this position, I will mention a few moves. So for example, the move bishop f5. After it, White continues with the move e3, e6, bishop e2, knight f6, short castle, and we will have a transposition to the Slav setups a bit later on when Black will play the move c6, strengthening his center. Now the best part, at least to my mind, in the whole repertoire is that White's moves are always the same, and therefore even if we perhaps forget some of the nuances or details of a variation, we can rest assured that by playing the standard moves, we will not make a mistake. Another move that's analyzed later on is the move e6, but after e3, knight f6, bishop e2, we will look at these positions later via the move order. Second move, knight f6. We will get there. Also, another move is the move c6, the so-called Slav setup, when Black supports the central pawn on d5 with the c pawn, leaving the diagonal open for the light squared bishop. But after e3, knight f6, bishop e2, we will have a transposition to the lines that we will look a bit later on. Another move is the move c5, immediately attacking White's center, but White simply continues with the standard moves e3, strengthening the center and allowing for bishop e2 and short castle. Let's say knight c6, bishop e2, knight f6, and we will take a look at this position a bit later on. And the final move that Black can play, bishop g4, attacking the knight on f3, but White simply ignores that and continues with e3. And after knight f6, bishop e2 again, we will have transposition to the Slav lines, most likely when Black plays the move c6 later on. So these are some of the possible transpositions. As you could see, first of all, they will be covered, and second, they shouldn't really be confusing because White reacts to them always in the same manner by continuing the intended development with e3 and bishop e2. Now we will take a look at the most popular moves, the knight moves, and we start with the move knight c6. It's played quite often and very often in combination with the other knight move, knight f6. And here we'll mostly look at the lines where Black avoids the move knight f6. So we will be looking at moves like the development of the bishop to f5 and g4. The idea of the development of the knight to c6 is to control this central square e5, and the plan that black can try to implement to justify the development of the knight here is the intended push in the center by e7, e5. So this pawn advancing for 2 squares. This plan is known in chess literature as the Chigorin's plan, and the development of the knight on c6 after the move d5, as in this case, is known as the Chigorin defense. So after this introduction, we can see the moves, and white's moves are, well, as expected, the standard ones: e3, intending the development of the bishop to e2, and then short castle. Now, we can take a look at some moves, for example, which also transpose, but some which are also not very good. So, for example, the first move that's not very good is the move e5, which is, you could say, yeah, it follows the idea of advancing in the center, but the problem with the move is that now this square is controlled 2 times by white. We noted this at the beginning, that one of the advantages of white setup is this strong control over the e5 square, and white's here that uses that fact but just to win a pawn, taking knight e5, and if knight e5, d takes e5, and white is a pawn up. A transposition to the other positions will happen after the move knight f6, bishop e2. We will look at these positions via the second move knight f6 instead of knight c6. And another move which black can try to justify the development of the knight to c6 is the move f6. Black understands that pushing e5 will lose a pawn immediately, so he's trying to push e5 now, which will be well controlled. And here is a good moment to note this typical reaction by white when understanding that e5 will be pushed, and to first strike in the center with the move c4. So the move c4 attacks this pawn on d5, intends knight c3 to further increase the attack, but it's also a prophylactic move, prophylactic meaning, well, preventing, also in chess, by the way. And the idea here is that it prevents the move e5. And the reason for this is that after e5, d takes e5, the d file is opened. Oops, wrong arrow. The d file is opened, and white attacks the pawn on d5 twice. That was why it was important to go c4. So this pawn is attacked twice, and when black recaptures the pawn on e5, white captures the pawn on d5, and again ending up with an extra pawn. So we looked at these moves, which are not that great, and now we take a look at some of the better moves, which are actually the development of the light squared bishop. So the light squared bishop can come to f5, or it can come to g4, which will be the next line we will take a look at. So after bishop f5, the bishop looks towards the pawn on c2, but for the time being, white just continues with the development, going bishop e2. And the intention is to castle short. And now in these lines, when there is this combination of a knight on c6 and a bishop on f5, it's always important to note that any, let's call it some sort of a primitive attack with knight b4, which is an attempt at a sort of a blitzkrieg, attacking the pawn on c2, and if white is not careful, then knight takes c2, which would be a check, and winning that rook on a1. It's important not to blunder this, and simply go knight a3. So defending the pawn on c2, and very quickly black's pieces will be pushed back, as white will continue with c3, hitting that knight on b4. We will also see a variation of this line after, let's say, the move e6, short castle, and now, for example, knight b4, as we saw earlier. If black does not go knight b4, black goes, let's say, knight f6, then c4. Yeah, this is one of white's main plans after finishing the development of the king side in castling. as it was described in the introduction, c4 or b3 and bishop b2, often both played. So after c4, the idea is to go, of course, knight c3, and later on, if necessary, b3, bishop b2. But let's check knight b4. Again, as we said, it's an attempt to win the game quickly by capturing the pawn on c2. And the reaction that white implements in this case is to go move knight a3. So the knight defends the pawn on c2. And then after c3, the knight on b4 will be attacked, which will be forced to go back. And when the knight goes back, then c4, the pawn will advance further, maybe c5, b4, b5, and advance on the queen side. So very easy, straightforward plan for white. So going back a little bit, let's check the other development of the bishop, bishop g4. Now there is no attack on the pawn on c2 as previously, but what black wants to do here is that black is pinning this knight on f3 because the knight cannot move as the queen is on the other end of the diagonal, so it will be lost. And by targeting it, black is renewing this idea of pushing e5. So now that capture on e5 won't be winning a pawn because black can recapture when white cannot recapture one more time, as then the queen will be lost. That's what pinning the knight on f3 means. But white, by continuing in the same planned manner with bishop e2, is at the same time breaking the pin. So now the knight can move from f3 because then the bishops will be facing each other and white won't be losing the queen on d1. And now, again, after knight f6, we will have a transposition to the lines looked at later on. Black has a choice. For example, simple development with something like e6 is possible. White continues along the usual lines, castles, bishop d6, and c4, playing in the center. Normally, when this bishop is on d6, when black develops the bishop on d6, the idea of c4 and c5 hitting the bishop is a very important one to remember, and we will see this idea working a bit later on. But if black wants to be really consistent with the idea of pushing e5, he should actually take on f3 immediately, and after bishop takes f3 to go e5. Luckily for white, that backfires and in fact loses for black. I will shortly demonstrate why. It's worth pointing out that other moves are better. For example, knight f6 is better, but white simply continues with c4. And now the point is that this bishop on f3 is very strong on this long light square diagonal, and white uses it to put pressure on black's center. With the c4 pawn already there, the queen also can join the attack on the queen side by being developed to b3 square, attacking the pawn on b7, being weakened by the absence of this bishop on c8. The point here is that this pawn on c4 that black can capture with dc4 is only temporary sacrifice for white, because white can now go queen a4, not to b3 where the queen will be lost obviously, but a4, from where the queen is attacking twice together with the bishop, the knight on c6, but also attacking this pawn on c4. And this double attack means that white will regain the pawn. Similar is a move like e6, c4 again, and with the standard basically development. Knight comes to c3, short castle, then b3, bishop b2, all the standard moves described in the introduction and moves that we will keep on seeing in this chapter. But let's see what happens if black goes e5. This was, after all, black's idea. But the problem here for black is that after d takes e5, the d file is open and the queen and the bishop together are attacking this pawn on d5. And this means that black loses a pawn. After knight takes e5, white has a really pleasant choice. Both captures of the pawn are possible. For example, if queen takes on d5, white gives up the light squared bishop, and knight takes f3. And now it's important not to take with the pawn, because then the queen is left without defense, but to take with the queen, and it's really a clear pawn up for white Additionally, the pawn b7 is hanging. As a main line, okay, as a preference, I chose to capture on d5 with the bishop, because in addition to the extra pawn, white also has this pair of bishops. Pairs of bishops is a very serious positional advantage, because the bishops control the colors, the color of both types of squares that are on the chessboard, both the light colors and the dark squares on the chessboard. So keeping both bishops normally is an advantage, because white can play on both square types, light squares and dark squares. And here, for example, the bishop also attacks the pawn on b7, and after something like c6 for attacking the bishop, the bishop drops back to b3, still staying alive. And white doesn't mind the exchange of queens, because queen takes d1, king takes d1. The king will have a very nice spot on e2. And then the other pieces will be developed. The rook can come to the open file. The bishop can come to d2 or c3. The knight can come to c3 or d2, just depending on circumstances. White can also advance with e4, then the bishop can be developed to e3, and so forth. A clear pawn up for white. So this concludes our analysis of the second move, knight c6, especially those lines when black doesn't go knight f6 quickly enough. So now we move to the most popular move, knight f6, following the symmetry in the position. White continues with e3, the outlined plan of development. Bishop comes to e2 and short castle. And now, as well, it can be expected, black has a wide choice of options, and we will look at all of them with, again, a note that some moves will lead to transpositions to lines analyzed by different move orders. So, for example, the development of the light squared bishop to g4 after bishop e2, e6, h3. Now, either way, whether black takes on f3 or escapes to h5, will be analyzed via the Slav move order, which includes the move c6. So, just to give you an example, bishop h5, castles, bishop d6, c4, and c6, and we arrive at the so-called Slav structures, c6, d5, e6. And the same applies to the development of the bishop to f5, bishop e2, e6, castles, bishop d6, c4, c6, and we have the Slav structure on the board. As we said, these will be analyzed via the third move, c6, that we will look at a bit later in this chapter. So now let's continue with the moves that do have some independent value, and one of them is the move g6. Now, the development of the bishop on g7 is a development known in the chess world as the fianchetto, fianchetto in Spanish, fianchetto in Italian. So it's a popular development of the king's bishop, because this structure around the black king, when it castles, is a very strong, very robust one, and difficult to attack. So it's a development that you should be aware of. White continues normally with this already intended moves, bishop e2, bishop g7, castles, castles. Then now white, in fact, can be a little bit more ambitious than the usual way of development that we have outlined, which is the move b3, which is perfectly fine also. But as I said, in this exact position, it's possible to be a bit more ambitious with b4. So the plan remains the same, bishop b2 and so forth, but white is grabbing a bit more space on the queen side. So the general plan is like a full advance pawn storm on the queen side with a4, b5, c4. You see these nice arrows. The pawns will come to these squares. The bishop will be developed to d2, to b2, and the knight to d2. So this is the general plan that white is pursuing. And to give you a bit of some illustration, what white can do against black's, let's say, immediate attempts. For example, a move like knight e4 is possible, centralizing the knight. And here it's important not to rush with the move knight d2, targeting this knight on e4, because knight c3 is a bit awkward. Yeah, so attacking the queen, the bishop, so it's a bit unpleasant. Therefore, black should precede this with bishop b2. So covering this c3 square and only then going knight bd2, challenging this knight on e4, and then the plan remains the same, c4, b5, a4, and so forth. Another direct option for black is the move a5, immediately trying to challenge white on the queen side, and here the correct reaction is to advance. It is part of the plan, so it's not too difficult. b5, and again the plan remains the same, a4, bishop b2, c4, knight d2, queen b3, and so forth. And in case black advances with a4, so to stop white's plan, a good idea for white is to develop bishop not on b2 now, but on a3. So it blocks the pawn from advancing further. Yeah, the bishop is quite active on a3, targeting this pawn on e7. And here white has an additional idea, which is to advance with c4 and then go knight c3 instead of knight bd2, not to d2, but to c3, and then together with the queen, there will be an attack on this pawn on a4. So easily this pawn can be lost. So these are some of the ideas that you should know in these positions. So that's the development of the bishop on g7, the fianchetto. Now let's move to knight c6. I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the move on the second as a second move that a bit later we will look at the positions where black develops both knights on c6, one and the other one on f6. White continues normally, bishop b2, and now black needs to decide whether they start developing the king side, so going e6, then bishop comes out and then short castle, or black decides to develop the light squared bishop first and then going e6, yeah, and then continuing with bishop e7 and short castle. So let's explore both plans. Yeah, e6 is an attempt to speed up the development of the king side. So the bishop will come to d6, more actively placed, let's say, and then short castle. So white continues with this planned idea, castling short, and bishop d6. Now, black's plan here, when you see these pieces, knight on c6, bishop on d6, you should immediately remember that both these pieces are controlling the e5 square. And black's idea is to push e5 in the center. And as a standard reaction, we already saw this in one of the earlier lines, is to start the attack first by playing c4, targeting this pawn on d5, but at the same time, I also mentioned this earlier, when there is a bishop on d6, the idea of advancing with c5, hitting that bishop on d6 is a very important one. So, what does black do here? Black can simply castle, yeah, and allow white to grab space on the queen side with this idea that I mentioned c5, or black can also take this pawn on c4. And it's important to know that this, when black takes on c4, while possible to take with the bishop, that's a bit suboptimal because the bishop will be forced to move twice early on in the game, which is not advisable generally. But white can do something better, which is also part of the planned development, and that plan is the move knight bd2. Yeah? We already know of this development of the knight, and here even it works even better because the knight wants to recapture this pawn on c4, from where it's targeting this a bit exposed bishop on d6. And now, the even more pleasant for white after making this move is that black is tempted to defend this pawn on c4 by the move b5, but this is actually bad, and we will see now why. Because white continues the attack on black's exposed pawn structure by a4, hitting this pawn on b5. Now if black advances or takes, then white simply takes this pawn on c4 and achieves the main idea. But the main trick here lies in the fact that a6 may look solid for black because he just defends the pawn on b5, but the problem is that after a takes b5, hitting that knight on c6, a takes b5, which would have been, of course, black's idea. The problem is that this rook on a8 remains without defense, and white wins it, and with it wins the game, being a clear rook up. So that's a nice little trap that black can fall into. So that's after d takes c4. And if in case of castling, c5. Remember this idea, it's common, and we will see it on more than once, grabbing space on the queen side by attacking this bishop on d6. The bishop drops back, and now already this space grabbing pawn on c5 indicates that white should actually support it and start play on the queen side. That play is most quickly started by the move bishop d2. Now the bishop is not developed to b2 as we normally expect to, but on d2 because it supports the b4 push by controlling the b4 square, because the knight was also controlling that square, so white needs to support this pawn to come to b4. And the plan is really straightforward. b4, b5, attack that knight on c6, a4, just a pawn avalanche on the queen side. An illustrative line is, for example, knight e4, going after this bishop on d2, but this doesn't stop white because b4 now is possible as that pawn is defended by the bishop. And the important thing is that if black takes that knight on d2, it's important to recapture with the queen to maintain the defense of that pawn on b4. And then b5 is coming, a4, knight c3, and so forth, with excellent play on the queen side. So let's go back now and check the alternative plan, which is not connected with the quick development of the king side as we saw with e6, but with a move like bishop g4, first developing the bishop and then intending to go e6. And now h3. I spoke about this in the introduction. It's a very useful move for white. He should always try to make it because, first of all, it forces black to determine their intentions, what to do with the bishop. Will the bishop retreat? Will the bishop capture the knight? And second, because this move h3 after the inevitable short castle for white will always allow for this escape square on h2 for the white king. And this just immediately from, let's say here it's move 5, you know that you are safe from any sort of accidents like back rank mates and so forth as the game progresses. So it's kind of takes one problem away in the future to think about. So no back rank mates will happen. The king is safe, so he can play more freely. Okay, but the bishop is attacked. What does black do? In fact, he can do two things, as I mentioned, escape to h5 or capture the knight on f3. Now let's check both options. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3. This gives white the advantage of the two bishops. I spoke a bit earlier why they are an advantage, because they control both the light squares and the dark squares, and white can play on both. And the bishop on f3 is quite good on the long diagonal. If allowed to do what white wants, for example, is something like e6, white will castle short, and then we know c4, knight c3, putting pressure on the center, and maybe queen b3, putting pressure on b7, then the bishop on f3 is quite strong and unopposed, which is also very important. But black did not take the knight on f3 just to go e6, but by eliminating that knight on f3, he actually increased his own control over the e5 square. So now the main idea is to go e5. Yeah, so then the pawn now is protected. So if white takes, black can recapture on e5. And now if you were paying attention, you will notice that earlier in the same position, when there was no knight on f6, we were capturing on e5. And the point being that after knight takes c5, we could capture this pawn on d5 because it wasn't protected. But here it is. The knight on f6 is defending that pawn. So now black in fact obtains very good game because the centralized knight threatens to take that bishop on f3, and if the bishop retreats, black simply continues with bishop d6 and very smooth development and space advantage in the center. Simply more pieces in the center than white. So this time, capturing on e5 is not the best reaction. What white should do, in fact, is castling. Now, you would say, okay, but why are we just allowing black to advance and so forth? But pay attention, because this is very important, and it's a subtle, strategical, I wouldn't call it a trap, but still temptation, let's say. That's a nice word. Now, I would expect most players just to go e4, attack that bishop and grab space in the center. But we can also check like what if black takes on d4. But then this gives white really easy play. White recaptures, then the rook is coming to the open file, knight comes to c3, targeting that pawn on d5, putting some pressure. The bishop is developed to f4 or g5, and very smooth and easy development for white. So the critical move is e4. And now the bishop draws back to e2. And you could say, but what have we gained here? In fact, we have gained a lot. The point is that there is no tension in the center now, no pawns are attacking each other. And white will use this to his own advantage. The idea is to push c4, so the pawn will advance as usual, and then the knight will come to c3, again as usual. This time both the pawn and the knight putting pressure on this pawn on d5, which can further be enhanced by developing the queen on b3. So from b3 the queen will also be attacking this pawn on d5 and at the same time attacking this pawn on b7. So we kind of lured black to advance, so we can counter-attack this, I would say, overextended center. So this is the idea to remember, and the kind of a cue to remember is that taking on e5, if it doesn't win the pawn on d5, as explained earlier, should be avoided, and white should castle to tempt black to go e4 when the bishop drops back, and then white starts a counter-attack in the center with c4, knight c3, queen b3, and so forth. So that's the bishop takes f3. Now let's see what happens if the bishop moves back. Bishop h5, white now castles, black goes e6, wants to develop, and c4. We know, as explained in the introduction, when white finishes with the development of the queen side, of the king side, there are two plans: b3, bishop b2 first, or c4 first. Yeah, in a lot of cases, both will be played. It's only a matter of order. And I try to explain each time why one move order is preferred over the other. In this case, we start with c4, and the idea is that we saw this idea earlier. We are kind of anticipating the development of this bishop on d6, so we can go c5, hit it, grab space on the queen side, and then go b4, b5 before some preparation, after some preparation. So it's worth noting that in case of a capture now on c4, without the bishop being on d6, the move knight bd2, while possible, it won't hit the bishop on d6 as earlier. So white can take, and you could say, but now black tricked white. Okay, now the bishop can come to d6. While true, white still can continue with knight bd2, connecting the knights. The bishop can drop back, and the knight can come to c4 again. You could argue that white wasted some time, or lost some time. And while this is true, it still doesn't affect white's plan and the good position he is obtaining. So generally in chess, solid plans work even when they are not executed with the, let's say, the absolute minimum of moves. But the most common move in this position is in fact the move bishop d6, and this plays into white's hands, as we shall see, because c5 is our intention. That's hitting the bishop on d6, bishop drops back, and now we can even use a small tactical help by playing b4 immediately. So we don't need bishop d2 here to support b4, as in the earlier line. We can go b4 immediately, intending b5 to attack this knight on c6. And this advance also includes a small trap, and the trap is that the pawn on b4, while can be taken, leads black into trouble. The trouble arises after the move queen b3. Now, careful, don't get too greedy by giving check and attacking that knight on b4, because the knight drops back, covers the check, and the knight is saved. So no, we go queen b3, attacking the knight, and we go after the pawn on b7. So the knight drops back to c6, and we take the pawn on b7. And very quickly, you see, we have regained the pawn, and at the same time, we have destroyed black's queen side. So now the knight on c6 is again attacked. There is the threat of bishop b5 to pin that knight. Cannot move because the king is on e8. So the only way for black to stay in the game is the following variation: knight a5, escaping the attack and attacking the queen. Queen goes to a6, renewing the attack on the knight on a5, c6 now, defending the knight, but you can see this is all very, very shaky because of this move bishop d2, and the knight is now really lost, even though not lost for free. But after knight c4, bishop takes c4, dc4, white captures on c6 with check, and has an overwhelming position because this pawn on c4 is also very weak and will likely be lost when white will have this fantastic central pawn chain. So this is the trick, yeah, that black is well advised not to fall into, not to capture that pawn on b4, but otherwise white simply has this great play on the queen side. So we go back now. Yeah, this is the analysis of the move knight c6. Now let's move on to the move c5. This is quite a good move for black, an active move. Black seeks to develop the knight to c6. Yeah, much better with the pawn on c5 than with the pawn on c7, as we saw in the lines that we just looked at. And also the pawn on c5 gives black additional options like taking on d4. So bishop e2, white is not bothered for the time being, developing as normal. So now knight c6 is a normal development. Black can start with taking on d4, and after e4 I will explain this capture a bit later on, because knight c6 castle is simply a transposition, so we will come to this position via the move knight c6. So short castle, yeah? And this is the sort of a position where black has a wider choice of plans. We will explore them now, but generally speaking, for white this matters very little, because the plan is to simply go b3 and bishop b2. Now, before going for into the exploration of let's say the better plans, let's explore two which are not that great for black. One is the so-called fianchetto with g6. And the problem is that it's a bit too slow. Bishop g7 short castle, as white can in fact take this pawn on c5 now. Okay, this is commonly not what we do, but here it works because we are anticipating black's development of the bishop on g7, and that makes it more difficult for black to recapture this pawn on c5. So bishop g7 and now knight bd2, part of our plan. Yeah, but the idea here is to go knight b3 and securely defend this pawn on c5 when white is a clear pawn up. So that's one move that is not that great. Another move that's not great is the move c4. And this move, in fact, can show us why in this repertoire I have opted for the development of the bishop on e2. So had the bishop been on d3, this move would have gained tempo by attacking the bishop. But with the bishop on e2, the bishop is safe, and this advance is actually a waste of time. In fact, it only allows white to start attacking this advanced pawn. And in case of c takes b3, a takes b3, white obviously improved his pawn structure because he exchanged the edge pawn, the a pawn, for black's c pawn. Yeah? And obviously now has a more compact connected pawn structure, so-called pawn islands. Yeah? And white will continue with c4, knight c3, and so forth. There is also a small trap here involved. If black is persistent, wants to keep his advanced pawn with b5, this won't last for long because white is successfully undermining this structure with a4, now attacking this pawn on b5, and everything crumbles because black cannot sustain it with a6, again thanks to the same trick we saw earlier. A takes b5, attacking the knight, and black cannot recapture with a takes b5 because this rook on a8 is unprotected and white wins it. So these are two of the moves that are not that great for black, g6 and c4. But now we look at some of the better plans for black. One of them is the move bishop g4. Makes sense, yeah, the bishop is developed to an active square. g4, we will also look at the development of the bishop to f5, and black wants to go e6, yeah, then bishop comes to e7 or d6 and short castle. We follow the rule of thumb, you know it, bishop appears on g4, try to harass it immediately with h3. Now again, choice for black, yeah, take or run away. In case of capturing bishop f3, we already know the drill, basically e6, yeah, and c4. So we're trying to enhance the activity of this bishop on f3 by attacking the pawn on d5 and hopefully removing it if black is greedy. Again, to show you why that's not good for black, d takes c4. This time bishop takes c6. The bishop is exchanged, but it completely ruins black structure. B takes c6 and queen a4. So attacking the pawn on c6, the pawn on c4, double attack ensures that white regains the pawn and at the same time leaves black with a crippled pawn structure. Note that queen d5 may look good, defending both pawns at once, but this is short-lived because knight c3 attacks that queen on d5 and the queen can no longer remain on a spot from where it defends both pawns. So that's not so great. So, which means that bishop h5 makes more sense, yeah? And now we go b3. Yeah? The move b3, part of white's plan. The idea is to develop the bishop on b2 on the long diagonal, yeah? And continuing then development with knight bd2 or c4, dc5 as we shall see. Now after b3, black normally continues e6, but it's worth pointing out that in case of c takes d4, yeah, we should follow the rule of thumb described in the introduction, which is whenever b3 has been played, that means that the bishop will be developed on b2. And for that, we need to keep this long diagonal open. That means never land a pawn on the d4 square. And that is achieved by always recapturing on d4 with a piece. Therefore, don't capture with pawn, capture with knight. At the same time, the knight is removed from f3 and there is an attack on this bishop on h5. So black should take on e2. And now again, follow the rule of thumb. Keep the diagonal open by capturing with knight. So we're keeping the diagonal open for bishop b2, then knight d2, c4, and so forth. In this particular case, okay, capturing with a queen is not the end of the world, even though knight d4, e4 forces us to have this pawn on d4. It's possible, but it's better always to stick to these rules of thumb that actually greatly help the navigation of the choices that white is faced with in the opening. So that's c takes d4, yeah? So let's check e6, bishop b2, continuing with the plan. And the knight will come to d2, c4 will be played, or c4 will be played immediately, and knight comes to c3, depending on circumstances, yeah? And now, again, black needs to decide what to do. The options are whether to continue with the development of the king side by moving the bishop or taking on d4, which again is an option. If black moves the bishop to d6, the same applies to e7. Another rule of thumb, capture on c5 only when black has already developed this bishop from f8, so to e7 or d6. The point being that after taking, the bishop is forced to move for a second time, bishop takes c5, yeah, after which white gains time to continue with the development with c4. And now the knight will come either to c3 or d2, depending on circumstances that white has completed the development with a very harmonious position. So if black wants to avoid this, then black is basically forced to take on d4 to prevent white from taking on c5. C takes d4, and now we follow the rule of thumb. So don't take with pawn, because that will blunt this bishop on b2. Always keep taking with a piece. So knight takes d4, at the same time attacking this bishop on h5. So bishop takes e2. And now it's not necessary to take with the knight. Yeah, we can take with the queen. The reason being that after knight d4, we don't have to capture with the pawn. We can capture with the bishop. Yeah, and the bishop remains on the open diagonal. If black doesn't take, he goes bishop d6. Yeah, we go knight d2, finishing development and intending c4. The rooks are coming to d1 to c1 in the central files. We advance with c4, possibly take on d5, depending on circumstances, and obtaining harmonious and nice development in the center. So this is the development of the bishop to g4. Let's see what happens if the bishop goes to f5. Well, similar things happen. Yeah, b3 already. We know the plan. It's worth pointing out that dc5 here is suboptimal, and if you were careful, you will notice why, because after e6, what will happen is that the bishop doesn't have to move twice to capture that pawn on c5, but from f8, it can capture on c5 directly without losing time. So we don't do that. We wait for that bishop to be developed. So we continue with our plan b3, e6, bishop b2, and now we're waiting for black to move the bishop. Yeah. Again, black can move the bishop and accept the fact that he will lose time after white captures the pawn on c5, or black can capture himself on d4, c takes d4, but we know what to do, keeping the diagonal open. So taking with the knight first, and after knight d4, queen takes d4, keeping the diagonal open. Yeah. And at the same time, in this concrete position, there is this also unpleasant check on b5 being threatened. So black goes bishop e7 or bishop d6, doesn't really matter because we know the rule of thumb. The bishop moves, take on c5, force the bishop to move again, and open the long diagonal. Bishop takes c5. And now a useful move for white in these positions, the little move a3. A little move, but the ideas are a bit bigger than that. The idea is to go b4, to expand on the queen side with tempo, attacking the bishop on c5. And then the plan for white remains the same. Knight bd2, c4, or c4 and knight c3 along the same lines. The fact that the pawn would be on b4 also allows for the queen to be developed to b3 to free the d1 square for the king's rook from f1. A sample line, let's say short castle, b4, attacking the bishop. Bishop drops back to d6, now knight bd2, and then b5 can also be played, attacking the knight on c6, c4, advancing in the center. The queen can come to b3, rook ac1, rook fd1, and so forth. Yeah. You may wonder what happens if black stops this plan and goes a5. Yeah, so it stops b4 by controlling that square, but nothing is for free in chess or in life that weakens this b5 square. So white takes advantage of that by playing c4, and now we see one of the advantages of keeping the knight on b1 for longer, because the knight can come to c3 and b5, yeah, targeting and taking advantage of this weakened square on b5. So these are small nuances that you will know, yeah, when navigating these positions. So that's the development of the bishop to f5. Now let's move to another option for black, which leads to completely different positions. And that move is the move c takes d4. And it's important to know what happens next, because this is different to what we have looked at, and also because it leads to a completely different pawn structure. Yeah, because in this case we haven't played b3. Yeah, so we don't need to keep any diagonal open. In fact, we can open another diagonal for the bishop, which is its original one, by capturing with the pawn. This is basically the only situation when white captures on d4 with the pawn. So there is no b3, no need to keep the long diagonal open. We can capture with the pawn. Additional problem that can arise, even though it's not that scary, but still it's a hint to kind of remind you that in this case we should capture with the pawn, is that after knight takes d4, black can advance with this e7 pawn in one go to e5 directly, attacking the knight on d4. We will see in later lines that the pawn is on e6 already, yeah, and then black loses time with pushing e5. Yeah, so e6 first and then e5, losing time. But here, black can just go e5 in one go, and well, it's suboptimal for white. So we take with the pawn. So a few words about this pawn structure, which is obviously different to everything we have seen so far. This pawn structure is called, in fact, the reversed Carlsbad structure. Why reversed? Because normally the Carlsbad structure arises, and it is black who has it in the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit decline. So with colors reversed, it is black who has this type of structure of these 4 pawns A, B, C, and D connected, and 3 pawns on the king side. So we call it, that's why we call it reversed Carlsbad, because the original Carlsbad arises for the black pieces. So this structure is very compact, and white's next move will inevitably be the move c3, advancing the pawn and connecting all these pawns, yeah, b2, c3, d4. And then white will continue with the development of the queen side. Let's see what this means in practice, yeah. First, transpositional information. If e6, c3, this is actually analyzed in the next chapter. In the chapter, black plays one knight f6 via the move order d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, and then e3, c5, and so forth. You can see the link in the text. So if black does not go e6, then he needs to develop the light squared bishop, first either to f5 or to g4, and we will check both options. So bishop goes f5, yeah, an active square for the bishop. Yeah. White goes c3, connecting the structure as already announced, e6. Yeah. And now the simplest, absolutely simplest way for white to play here is also the natural move bishop d3. So we want to exchange this active black bishop, yeah. And after bishop d3, queen d3, we see the let's say the comfort factor of the Carlsbad structure is that it allows for very smooth development of the pieces. So the bishop goes to g5, the knight comes to d2. And then there are quite a few attacking options, in fact, that white has in this position. So one of the rooks will come to e1, rook ae1 or rook e1, ae or fe1, yeah, supporting a knight jump to e5. Yeah, so a knight will land on e5. And then white has quite a few options, as I said, to attack. One is the rook swing, rook e3, and then to g3, to h3. Another idea is to advance with the pawn h4, h5, h6. Another idea is when a knight lands on e5, the knights from d2 can come to f3. Or if the f1 square is allowed, it can go to f1 and g3. So all these maneuvers are possible, and white will use at least some of them to try to build an attack against black's king, which inevitably will be castled to the king side. So this is the general plan that and general ideas that white should have in mind in this Carlsbad position after the exchange of the light squared bishops. As we shall see, something similar will happen even when the light squared bishops are not exchanged. So let's go back and check bishop g4. Yeah. Another active move, developing the bishop and intending e6. c3, as we said, connecting the structure, yeah, the natural move, e6. And now, just to keep it again very consistent with the line we just saw, white will aim for the exactly same development of the pieces, so the bishop goes to g5. Putting in on f4 is perfectly fine too, yeah? But let's just not confuse things and go for exactly the same development. Bishop goes to g5, yeah, bishop e7. After something like h6, okay, bishop can drop back to h4, yeah? So it's the same. So bishop e7 and now knight bd2. So we have the same development, the difference being that these light squared bishops are on the board. And this, in fact, after short castle, works in white's favor because next move is important, bishop d3. So this is the best square by far for the light squared bishop. It's very active there. It targets black's king side. And white's plan is similar to what we were looking at before. First, in order to land the knight on e5, white needs to get out of this pin of this bishop on g4. So queen will come to c2 to enhance the attack on the pawn on a7. And then the knight will land on e5. Rook will come to e1. Yeah? And once these things are all set in place, this bishop on g4 will find itself a bit, let's say, exposed. Yeah? Especially the knight on e5 will be targeting it, yeah? And very often black may choose to go bishop h5, bishop g6 to lose tempo to exchange the bishops now. And some good idea for you to know in this situation is an exchange of the bishops on g6. Yeah, okay. So when black takes h takes g6, white goes g3, king g2, h4, rook h1, and h5 with an attack. If necessary, this knight can be eliminated, and after h5, white will open the h file for the rook. Quite an efficient and very strong attacking plan for white in those positions when the bishops are exchanged on g6. So this is the development of the play in this version of the Carlsbad structure. Now we go back and check, instead of c takes d4, the most commonly played move in this position, the move e6. White continues with the usual plan, b3, intending bishop b2. And again, black is at a crossroad. What is he supposed to do? Develop the bishop and then allow d takes e5 losing tempo, or taking on d4. So let's check both. Bishop e7, the same applies to bishop d6, yeah, because white reacts in exactly the same way. D takes e5. So the rule of thumb, the bishop moves, take on c5, force it to move again. And bishop takes c5 and bishop b2. So we have the long diagonal open and quite in line with the whole opening strategy. Castles and a3. We already saw this idea. We have this bishop on c5, so we go a3. We want to go b4. We want to go b4 to attack that bishop on c5 and gain space on the queen side. We already also know the reactions. If black stops b4 by playing a5, controlling the b4 square, we go c4, yeah, and then the knight can target this weak square on b5. And if black just removes the bishop away from c5, anticipating b4, yeah, we are not in a rush. We can go knight bd2 first. Yeah, and then we are ready for b4 c4 expansion. Yeah, so for example, black continues with b6, b4, we expand, bishop b7, and now we can even be a little bit subtle. We can go rook c1, looking a bit sneaky, yeah, preparing c4, yeah, which comes on the next move. Then, as already described earlier, the queen can come to b3 and the other rook can come to d1. Yeah, so white will have really nice control over the central files. So that happens in case of bishop e7. I'm pretty sure that by now you have noticed that these common themes are always present, yeah, and you can easily navigate the opening simply by remembering the rules of thumb and the common themes. So now let's check if c takes d4. Again, we know the rule of thumb, keep the diagonal open by capturing with piece. So knight takes d4. And the plan is, of course, still the same, bishop b2 and c4. What does black do now? Let's check development options first, yeah, and then capturing on d4, and also e5 is also an option, yeah. So let's check first bishop d6, bishop b2, yeah, castles, and c4. And after c4, depending on circumstances, white will develop the knight on c3 or on d2. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about white strategic ideas, which are not only common for this variation, they can also arise in different ones, and the possible scenarios that can arise after what I'm about to describe. So when there is this tension with the pawns on c4 and d5, white generally wants to capture that pawn on d5. And then when that happens, black has a choice to recapture with a pawn, yeah, or to recapture with a knight. And depending on which way black recaptures, we have two scenarios. Now, I will make some random moves, yeah, to describe this scenario. So let's say h6, knight c3, a6, and c takes d5. Yeah. So the scenarios are the following. If black recaptures with a pawn, then he ends up with this so-called isolated queen's pawn. Isolated because there are no pawn buddies on the files next to the pawn to support it. So it's kind of a lone warrior here in the center, which is well blockaded by this knight on d4. Yeah? And after a developing move like rook c1, white normally seeks to play against it, blockading it, or an idea is to capture on c6 and then go knight a4, opening the file for the rook. Maybe the knight can land on c5, an excellent control of these blockading squares on d4 and c5. So that's one scenario. Yeah, when black chooses to play with an isolated queen pawn. The alternative scenario is if black captures with a piece. Now, will be another isolated pawn after knight takes c6 and b takes c6, and that pawn is this pawn on c6 and also the pawn on a6 to a lesser extent because it's a bit further away. But now this pawn on c6 is quite weak, and white's play is really simple. The queen coming to c2, rooks coming to the center, and generally playing against this pawn on c6, knight a4, attacking it, opening the c file and attacking it, landing a knight on c5, and so forth. Yeah, so white is concentrating his forces against that pawn on c6. So these are the two possibilities that can happen once white takes on d5. So it's important to know about these two possible scenarios. Now there's the move bishop d6. Yeah, let's check e5. If you remember a bit earlier, I was speaking that taking with the Carlsbad structure, yeah, the reverse Carlsbad, when we were capturing with the pawn on d4, we were actually avoiding one version of this, but in that version, black's pawn was on e7, so black could go e5 in one go. But here, the pawn is already on e6, and we have a pawn on b3, so if one move extra each. So if black wants to expand in the center with e5, he needs to do that with a loss of tempo. So first e6, then e5. The knight is attacked. White doesn't lose time, taking on c6, b takes c6, and now c4. And part of the plan, first and foremost, and second, the follow-up is the same. Bishop comes to b2, attacking this pawn on e5, the knight comes to c3. Yeah. And then when white finishes development in this way, there are a few ideas that white needs to know. And one of them is the provocative bishop f3, I would say, attacking this pawn on d5 and luring black to push e4. So it appears that white is losing a tempo, but the tempo is lost for one idea, and that is when the bishop drops back to e2 after e4, white obtains this beautiful long diagonal open and access to this d4 square, which is a very good one either for a knight or for a bishop or even for a queen if the queen cannot be harassed there. So that's one positional idea. Whereas the other one, after knight c3, bishop b2, and so forth, yeah, is to capture on d5, cd5, open the c file, so the rook will come to c1, and then the knight can come to a4 and land on the c5 square. And this can be supported by a queen from c2, a queen can come to d2, rook can come to d1 to put pressure on the d5 pawn and so forth. But generally the knight landing on c5 and eventually advancing with these 2 against 1 on the queen side. Yeah. So these are the main positional ideas and strategical ideas that white has at his disposal in these structures. So now let's check another developing move, bishop c5. A bit more active than on d6, for example, but bishop b2, white continues with the development, short castle, and now c4. Yeah. Continuing with the plan. Yeah. And now this is an interesting position because it involves, some, let's say, couple of small traps. Simply because black's best move is one that is not obvious, yeah, and one that is not so easy to make. So let's check first the so-called traps. Yeah. So the first so-called trap, yeah, is the move e5. It attacks the knight, but it loses a pawn. Knight takes on c6. The long diagonal is open, and white wins a pawn. B takes c6, bishop e5, winning a pawn. Another suboptimal move is knight takes d4. And this is, well, I think the only situation where we don't keep the long diagonal open, and the reason is that after e d4, we attack the bishop with tempo, and when the bishop moves, we go c5. And now we really get these pawns going very fast. And that is the reason why we take with the pawn in this situation. And the third not so good option for black is d takes c4. And we have seen this before, knight takes e6, b takes c6, and bishop takes c4. And now black is riddled with these isolated pawns, one on a7 and the other one on c6. Yeah. And white's play is really simple. Queen c2, knight d2, put the rook on the c file and just simply play on the c file. Whereas in case of an exchange of queens, nothing really changes. The knight can come to c2 or on d2 or c3, can come to a4, attack that bishop on c5, go rook c1, and target eventually the pawn on c6. So what's black's best move then, yeah? Well, the surprising bishop takes d4. Yeah, giving up the bishop. But now white can keep the diagonal open, take with the bishop, knight d4, queen d4, and then again, black still needs to solve the problem with this light squared bishop, which is blocked by the pawn on e6. So white continues in the same ways: knight c3, rook, put rooks in the center on c1, on d1, yeah, with easy play in the center. So that's the move bishop c5. And now we explore the last option for black here. Knight takes d4. It's the most commonly played move in the position. And now queen d4. Rule of thumb, remember, keep the long diagonal open. Few options for black here. Still, let's say bishop d6. They don't really affect white's play. Bishop b2, short castle, and c4. Yeah. Again, natural moves. The rook is coming to d1. Yeah. Black cannot take dc4 because with the rook on d1, the bishop on d6 would be hanging. Knight can come to c3 to put pressure on the d5 pawn. Yeah, and similar is, let's say, bishop b7, bishop b2 castles. And now we can be also a bit sneaky, not c4 immediately, but first let's say rook d1. Yeah, and the point is after c4, and if dc4, when the queen moves, the rook will be attacking the queen on d8. Yeah, but the general plans and general ideas remain the same. So b6 is another way to develop, also allowing for bishop c5 to attack the queen on d4. So bishop b2, white continues along the same lines, bishop c5. And now an interesting move, queen h4. So the queen could have dropped back, but queen h4 is a bit more ambitious because it targets this knight on f6. And after short castle, bishop d3 already introduces some traps. So for example, if black is completely careless, and he continues with the development with bishop b7. He loses on the spot. Bishop takes f6, capturing the knight. Queen f6, yeah. And queen h7 is a mate thanks to the attack. Yeah, that both the queen and the bishop on d3 were attacking the pawn on h7. Well, black should be a bit more careful here. For example, h6, avoiding a bishop f6 and queen h7 mate. And now white goes knight d2, finishing development and intending perhaps landing this knight to e5. And the bishops are looking towards the king's side. The queen is here nearby, so tactical shots or opportunities may arise. Knight e4 is one more move that we can take a look at, attacking this queen on h4. White can exchange queens, but he can also keep the queen on the aggressive position by going queen g4, threatening mate on g7, forcing black to go back. Now, if you're happy with the draw, just go back to h4, yeah? But no need to, you can drop back to g3, yeah? And now there is no knight e4, yeah? Because then it's queen g7 mate, thanks to this bishop defending the queen. And otherwise, the same idea of knight d2, knight f3, knight e5 applies, yeah? So quite a good middle game position for white. So this wraps up the analysis of the move c5. And now we move to the analysis of the so-called Slav defense setups with the move c6. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, this setup can arise via different move orders, especially if the bishop first gets out from c8 to f5 or g4, and then black goes c6. Yeah. So just to simplify things, we'll look at all of them after the move c6 on move 3. So bishop e2, the standard development for white. And now it's important to distinguish that black has three different Slav setups. Yeah. So the first one is to develop the bishop to f5 and g4 and then play e6. Yeah, that's one. The second is to go e6 immediately, the so-called semi-Slav setup, keeping the bishop on c8. Yeah. And the third one, which we have seen a bit earlier, is the fianchetto with g6. In the Slav, this development is called the Schlechter defense, so the mixture of the Slav and a little bit of the Grunfeld, let's say. So these are the three options for black. So let's check all of them, yeah? So g6, yeah, we saw this one, castles, bishop g7. And now, if you remember, I mentioned that it's perfectly possible to play b3, but in this particular setup, when black goes for the fianchetto, white can be more ambitious and go b4. Yeah? And the plan really remains the same. Bishop b2, c4, knight d2, a4, b5, and so forth. Yeah, I described this earlier. And I also invite you to take a look at the model game Grandelius Gachwiller, where white really played really well up to a certain point, and really showed the potential of the white's expansion plan. So that's the move g6. Yeah. Now let's check the semi-Slav development, e6. The idea of the semi-Slav is to develop the bishop to d6, the knight to d7 castle, and then execute the e5 push. Yeah. So let's see how white deals with that. Short castle. Now bishop d6. Both, like all three moves, bishop d6, knight b7, and short castle will be played. So the move order doesn't really make a difference. Black can start with knight b7, but after b3, bishop d6, and we have the same thing. Yeah. So bishop d6, b3, let's say castle, or knight d7, doesn't really matter. Bishop b2, knight d7, and c4. So all these moves will be played, yeah, by both sides, inevitably leading to this position. So here, white wants to develop the knight to c3. It's a more active square than d2. And generally speaking, will seek to execute the e4 push. We will see how this works. Normally, it will be helped by the queen from c2, sometimes with the bishop from d3. I mentioned already that black's main idea of the semi-Slav is to push e5, but for the time being, that is not possible, simply because white controls that square too many times. So natural move for black would be the move rook e8 to further support the advance of the e-pawn. But there is also an alternative plan like the move b6. Black temporarily at least gives up on the idea of pushing e5 and simply wants to develop the bishop to b7. In this case, white develops exactly along the same lines, knight c3, bishop b7, and queen c2. And the plan, as I described, is to push e4. Bishop can come to d3, yeah, the rooks can come to the center, d1, e1, and e4 will be executed. Bear in mind that you can execute e4 in more than one version. For example, after bishop d3, e4 immediately is possible. Or putting one rook and then e4, or putting two rooks and then e4. So just depending on how black also reacts. But generally, that is the plan. I would also invite you to take a look at the model game Svane or Rozbaev, where white nicely showed how to execute this advanced e4 under good circumstances. Now, let's take a look at the move rook e8, which is a more direct move, yeah, intending to push e5. So knight c3, yeah, and the move, the plan still remains the same: queen c2, bishop d3, and e4. And what's notable here for white is that black cannot execute the e5 push, yeah, because that loses a pawn, thanks to this knight being on c3 and the pawn on c4, targeting the pawn on d5. So d takes e5, opening the d file and attacking the pawn for a third time. So queen 1, knight 2, pawn 3. Knight e5, now cd5, cd5, knight d5, winning a pawn. It's important just not to blunder after knight d5, queen d5. And if black plays for a trick, knight g4, the trick is that it opens the diagonal for the bishop. So bishop h2 would be a check and the queen will be lost on d5. Yeah, but simply defending the queen and attacking this pawn on the bishop on d6, sorry. And white basically is a clear pawn up with a winning position. So that's the Semislav development. Now, let's take a look at the developments of the bishop. So bishop f5, yeah, and then intending e6. White castles, normal stuff, e6, yeah, c4, bishop d6 or knight bd7, doesn't really matter. And now an important moment for white in this line, and it will also be good to know why c4 was played and not b3 and bishop b2. The idea was of c4, as we shall see, is to allow for the development of the knight to c3. But here it's concrete. This is general explanation, but the concrete justification starts with the move knight h4. So this bishop on f5 is what we are after. Yeah, and the justification also of c4 is that if the bishop escapes to e4, then knight c3 comes in handily and the bishop is attacked. So the knights are controlling all the squares the bishop can go to and the bishop will be exchanged. So that means that we need to explore the positions, what happens when the bishop is exchanged. Bishop g6 is normally played, and now the simplest is to take on g6 immediately, not having to consider the capture on every move. H takes g6. Now it's important not to blunder this pawn on h2 because the h file is opened. Yeah, so the bishop on d6 is also attacking the pawn on h2. And now to the move g3. Now why g3, not h3? Yeah, not h3, but g3. Now the reason is that when we place these pawns on dark squares, as they are now, they limit the mobility of this bishop. Yeah, so this is just a very strong structure, and the bishop is basically quite passive in the sense that it's not doing anything by attacking the g3 pawn because that pawn is very strongly defended. So by placing the pawns, it's a well-known strategical rule that when the opponent has a bishop, we try to put our pawns on the color square of that same bishop because the pawns are very good at limiting the mobility, because when they are defended, the bishop has less squares to control. And in this position, after, let's say, knight bd7, knight d2, white's general plan is to execute the e4 push and open the position for the pair of bishops. Yeah, you remember we spoke about them a bit earlier. So that will be done by queen c2, bishop f3, yeah, and eventually executing e4. White doesn't really need to rush with pushing e4. He can go rook d1, maybe b3, bishop b2. But eventually, the general idea of this position is to open it up, not to remain closed as it is now, with black being really solid in the center, but to open it up, open some files, so that the bishops can be more free in their activity. So that happens with the development of the bishop to f5. Remember to chase it with knight h4. What about bishop g4 then? Yeah. So perfectly possible, yeah. e6, h3, attacking the bishop, the standard move that we usually play, rule of thumb. And now, does the bishop remain alive or is it exchanged for the knight? We can explore both. If bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, e6, yeah, castles, bishop d6, now b3, slower development, castles, c4, knight bd7, knight c3, and then again, the same idea as in the previous line. The difference is that there is no pawn on g6 and there is no g3, but there is h3 in this case. But the plan remains the same. Queen comes to c2, bishop comes to b2, rooks are coming to the center, and eventually e4 happens. Yeah, the plan remains the same, advance in the center. With the same idea, opening the position for the pair of bishops. Bishops need space, need open diagonals, so that's why white wants to open the position. It's more critical if the bishop runs away. Bishop h5, castles e6, and now c4. Yeah. So in this case, the bishop cannot be trapped, as in the line with knight, where the bishop was on f5 and knight h4 was a possibility. Here it is not. So what white does in this position is using the plan of queenside expansion. You remember we saw this one earlier in the chapter when the bishop appeared on d6. The idea of pushing c4 first and not going b3 is that after the expansion with c5, the pawn can come to b4 in one go, not having to waste time. b3 first and b4 next. So now we follow the typical Slav development for black, bishop d6 and knight bd7. Worth noting is that if the bishop goes to e7, now there is really no point in going c5 without attacking the bishop. So white changes the plan, goes knight c3, knight bd7, b3. And then when the bishop comes to b2, this is something different from what we have said so far. The plan is actually to plant a knight on e5 and possibly support it with f4, a bit more aggressive in the center. Yeah, so in this particular case, that is the best plan because pushing e4 is not really an option because it's well protected, and going bishop queen c2, bishop d3 would allow bishop f3, gf3, which is not that great, weakening the king side. So in the absence of queenside expansion and the absence of e4 plans, white should actually land the knight on e5. But normally when people play Slav, they normally go bishop d6 and knight bd7, which is the standard Slav development. So knight c3, we already know that. Castles or knight bd7, both moves will be played, and white reacts in the exactly same way, c5. So grabbing space, attacking the bishop, bishop c7. Yeah, the bishop stays on the b8 h2 diagonal, h2 b8 diagonal, because the idea is knight bd7 and e5. So from there, it still controls the e5 square. Yeah. So b4. Now we see the idea why white did not play b3 earlier, because the pawn moves to b4 in one go. Now, if black tries to stop b5 by going a6, white goes a4. First, he will go bishop b2, defend this pawn, the rook on a1, and then b5. The idea being that after a b5, the a file is open, so when black takes the rook on a1, white can recapture with the queen or with the bishop. And in case of knight bd7, b5, already establishing contact and advancing on the queen side. The rook will come to b1, and after bc6, white will control the open b file. And after bc6, an idea like queen a4 can be quite problematic for black because it would target this pawn on c6. So black should be quite kind of fast with the counterattack. So let's check e5. But now after the exchanges in the center, knight takes e5. Yeah, take with the knight to attack the bishop on a5. Yeah, bishop takes e2, and now it's important to capture with the knight. Why? Immediately you will understand why, because after knight takes e5, d takes e5, the d4 square is freed for the knight. Yeah, so bishop e5, rook b1. We already know the rook belongs to the b file, and then the knight wants to come to d4 from where it can attack the pawn on c6. And if black takes that knight, then we keep the diagonal open. Queen takes d4, bishop b2, and the diagonal is very strong for white. Unopposed bishop and unopposed queen. Yeah, on the long diagonal, when black will have problems moving this knight from f6 because the mate on g7 can easily happen. Yeah, so that's the reason of why white captures on e2 with the knight. So and generally here the plan is as I described. Knight comes to d4, put pressure on c6. If black doesn't take, queen can come to a4 to put even more pressure on c6, pawn on c6. Quite a pleasant initiative for white here. So okay, this was the analysis of the Slav plans with c6. And now we move to the, again, most commonly played move e6. Yeah, it's understandable because black simply follows symmetry, and I can assure you that a lot of players will just copy your moves and play the same as you do. the idea behind the move obviously is to develop the bishop and castle short, just like white. Yeah, so bishop e2, and again we need to check what happens if black follows symmetry with bishop e7, but also if black wants to break the symmetry and develop the bishop on the d6 square. Note that the move c5 after short castle knight c6 b3, we already looked at this via the move order third move c5. So let's check first if black breaks the symmetry with bishop d6. Castles, castles, b3, white continues along the normal lines, yeah. So what does black do now? Well, black should develop, right? And the problem piece is this light squared bishop. So black needs to decide like whether to go b6, bishop b7 now, or maybe go knight bd7 and c5. Yeah. It's worth noting that the move c5, we already saw this one. Yeah. And we react in the usual way. The bishop moved. Rule of thumb, force it to move again, take on c5 and bishop b2, knight c6, a3. Remember that small move, intending b4. We already looked at these lines via the move order third move, c5. So let's check b6. So black follows the symmetry, but the difference is in the position of the bishops. And we will see this will play a role. So bishop b2, bishop b7, c4. Just advancing in the center. Now, if black captures on c4, we normally recapture with the b pawn towards the center. So the b pawn now becomes a c pawn. So we have central advantage in pawns. The knight will come to c3. And generally speaking, white will seek to advance even further in the center with d5. Whereas if black goes knight bd7, knight c3, this development is analyzed via the option knight bd7 instead of b6. So black goes knight bd7 first and only then goes b6. We'll look at it via that move order. So here we look at the symmetry with c5. Yeah. And this is a, let's say, standard typical situation that can happen in these lines quite a bit. When all these four pawns are kind of at a standoff. Yeah. So everybody can take everybody. Yeah. So this 4 pawn c4, d4, c5, d5. Yeah. And here we have the rule of thumb that the usual way for white to react when this standoff happens is to capture on d5. So c takes d5. Now, as I explained earlier in the chapter, when this capture happens, there are two possible scenarios. Black recaptures with a piece or black recaptures with a pawn. Now, if black recaptures with a piece, yeah, we will look at these in a bit more detail. Now I'm speaking more generally. White's idea will be to advance with e pawn, e4 or maybe even e5. General idea, yeah. If black recaptures with a pawn, then white's idea is to go knight c3, first develop, and then the following maneuver, which you should remember after something like rook c1, is to go rook e1, and then to reroute this bishop from e2 to g2. So bishop f1, g3, and bishop g2. The reason is that this pawn on d5 will be targeted by that bishop on g2 after the knight from f3 moves. This also, putting the bishop on g2, solidifies white's kingside. So this is the plan that you need to remember in the positions when black recaptures with the pawn. Now, to put all this into moves, words into moves, let's explore. Black recaptures with a piece, bishop d5. This is the worst option of the two, because after knight c3, the bishop is immediately under attack, and white wants to capture it and obtain the advantage of the pair of bishops. So the bishop drops back, losing tempo. And now knight b5. This is the first instance when we see that the bishop on d6 is not so happily placed. It may have looked like a good idea for black to develop it early on, but now it's exposed. And this attack also contains in itself a small trick, as if the bishop moves to e7, dc5, we capture on c5, and if black captures on c5 after queen takes d8, rook d8, knight c7 wins the trapped rook on a8. So it's a small trap that black should be aware of, and we will be happy to play it. Now, if black captures with the other piece, which is the better option, knight takes d5, yeah, now knight bd2. So the idea of the development of the knight to d2 is that it can come to c4 and attack again that exposed bishop on d6. Yeah, so you see again, it's more of a drawback for black than an advantage of having the bishop seemingly more actively placed. An alternative is to take on c5, but there's no need to, let's say, improve the position of the bishop. We will explore this position later on via the move order with the bishop on e7, but here we can take advantage of the bishop on d6 by going knight bd2 and targeting it. And the third option, taking with the pawn, we go knight c3, yeah, and like I said, rook comes to c1, rook comes to e1, bishop f1, g3, and bishop g2. I mentioned the bishop on g2 is very well placed, looking towards this pawn on d5, and solidifying the king side. Yeah, the knight on c3 is also quite good. It can go to b5 as we saw to attack this bishop on d6, but also after d takes e5, it can open the d file and further attack this pawn on d5. So this is the plan to remember in these types of positions when black recaptures with a pawn. So that is the development with b6. Now let's check knight bd7 first. As I said, these plans can transpose into each other. We try to kind of distinguish them by pointing out the transpositions. So bishop b2. And now a choice for black. For example, black can go rook e8 with some semi-Slav ideas to push e5. Black can go b6. We saw this plan, but this time with the knight on d7. And black can immediately play in the center with c5. So let's check all the options. So rook e8, the idea is to go e5, but if you remember, our reaction to e5 is to counterattack first in the center by targeting this pawn on d5. Now, black should take on c4 because the immediate e5 just loses a pawn. c5, hitting the bishop, bishop drops back, and knight e5. Yeah, and we have won a pawn. Yeah, knight e5, d5, and, well, an extra pawn, yeah. If the knight comes to d7, yeah, then we take on d5 and we remain with an extra pawn. And that means that black should actually take on c4, but then again, we take with the pawn towards the center. And again, e5, c5 is possible, attacking the bishop, otherwise knight comes to c3. And if allowed, then even e4 after knight c3 to expand in the center. Let's check b6. c4, bishop b7. Yeah, so black is a bit waiting with the advance of the c pawn. Yeah, and now we can use that to develop our knight on a more active square to c3. We saw that this works quite well when the bishop is on d6 because knight b5 is often an idea we would like to pursue. What does black do now? Well, a6 is one move, covering the b5 square, yeah, not preventing knight b5, and now a4 is a good idea for white to remember. Yeah, we want to go a5 and harass black on the queen side. Another move is the move knight e4, which is made possible because that square is well controlled by black, but we simply continue with the development with rook c1, placing the rook on the file that can potentially be opened by after c takes d5. And now it's very nice to know that the most commonly played move in this position, the move f5, which looks kind of aggressive and, you know, expansive, is in fact a mistake. And the mistake is, again, the reason for the mistake is that this bishop on d6 is overexposed. Knight b5. We go after the bishop. And the bishop cannot escape because bishop b7, c takes d5, opens the c file, and black's position collapses. E takes d5, knight c7, attacking the rook. And when the rook moves away, knight e6 is a fork, and we win material. So c5 remains. We already know the rule of thumb, what we are supposed to do when these 4 pawns are facing each other, we take on d5. We have the same 2 scenarios. How does black recapture? With a pawn or with a piece? If black recaptures with the pawn, we go rook c1 first, and then you know the drill. Rook e1, bishop f1, g3, bishop g2. Solidify the king side, and then try to play against these pawns in the center. At some point, maybe taking, attacking this pawn on d5, or keeping the pawn on d4, going knight b5, attacking that bishop, moving the queen, then maybe the rook can come to d1. Many ways to maneuver in a very solid position for white. Taking with a piece is the alternative. Now we take on d5, inviting black to take with the pawn for a second time, which doesn't really change our plans. Rook c1, and then rook e1, bishop f1, g3, bishop g2. Still with the same ideas. The absence of the knights doesn't really affect white's subsequent play. And if bishop d5, remember what the idea was. Whenever black takes with the pawn, we try to push the e-pawn. So queen d3, intending e4, e5, hitting both bishops along the way. And now again a cute trap here. If black tries to stop the advance by knight f6, controlling the e4 square, we take on c5, attacking that bishop in the process, and bishop c5 can be met by knight g5. So the knight is controlling the e4 square, so we threaten e4, but we threaten something stronger, and that is to take on f6 and then deliver mate on h7. For example, h6 would be super careless. Bishop takes f6, queen h7, ends the game very nicely in our favor. So that is the development after black's 7th move, b6. We need to check what happens after c5. I'm sure by now you remember the rule of thumb. Black has moved with the bishop, so we are taking and forcing it to move again. Only that this time black has the additional option of recapturing with the knight, which he should take care of, should take advantage of right now. Just to check the alternative, bishop c5, a3, that little move, intending b4, and if a5, c4, targeting that pawn, that square on b5. We already know this, we saw it more than once. So the difference is knight takes c5, and now we go knight d2. So planning the usual advance with c4. b6, black should develop the light squared bishop. If black lands on e4 with the knight, that just doesn't really matter much to white. Exchanging knights, knight e4, knight e4, and c4. Standard play, targeting this pawn on d5, even though it doesn't really hang because of this bishop h2 trick, when the queen will be taken, but still white wants to take and then force black to take when black will have an isolated pawn on d5. So it's better to go b6 and c4. And again, we have a relatively standard position where the plans, where the ideas that white has at his disposal are pretty well known. The rook will come to c1. One idea is b4 to target that knight on c5, then that pawn on b4 can be defended with a3. After b4, queen b3 is also an option. Note that the bishop on d6 can be targeted. After the exchange in the center, c takes d5. Knight can come to c4 to target the bishop. The other knight can come to d4 if it needs to be centralized. So all these ideas that we know from the other lines are also applicable in this position as well. So that wraps up the analysis of the slightly symmetry breaking move bishop d6. Now we turn our attention to the complete symmetry, bishop e7, and after castles, b3. So following the plan. In this position, black should continue with the symmetry and go b6, because after c5, you probably remember the rule of thumb. The bishop has already moved. Force it to move again. D takes c5, bishop c5, bishop b2, knight c6, a3, that small move. intending b4. We already studied this position via the move order, third move, c5. So b6, bishop b2, bishop b7, c4. And now again, final crossroad for black. Yeah, go for symmetry c5 or develop with knight bd7. Taking on c4, while possible, it's not that great because it just helps white to establish a pawn advantage in the center with these all three pawns, and then the knight is coming to c3 with pretty smooth development. So black can prepare c5 with knight bd7 or push c5 immediately. So let's check both options. Knight bd7 first, yeah, and now knight c3. More active, square, and putting more pressure on the d5 pawn. So c5, no real other way to continue. 4 pawns in the center, we know the rule of thumb, take on d5. Yeah. And I will repeat again the two scenarios. Black captures with a piece or black captures with a pawn. If black recaptures with a piece, the white's plan is to advance with the e-pawn if possible. Yeah. And if black recaptures with a pawn, then rook c1, rook e1, bishop f1, g3, and bishop g2 is the intended regrouping. So to illustrate, e5, rook c1, yeah, and then rook is coming to e1, bishop f1, g3, and bishop g2. It's normally better for black to recapture with a piece. So knight takes d5, exchange on d5, inviting black to capture with the pawn, which black should decline. So bishop d5 is better. If e5, rook c1, again, rook e1, bishop f1, g3, bishop g2 is still very much valid. So bishop takes d5, yeah? And now it's an important moment not to confuse things, because we had almost the exact position previously when the black bishop was on d6. And if you remember, in that position we were playing the move queen d3 with the idea of e4, yeah, attacking the bishop, and possibly e5. But in this position there is no bishop on d6, meaning that the bishop is less exposed and it's on e7. So this move queen d3 now has less impact. Yeah, that is why we don't play queen d3, but we rather play rook c1. Yeah, we are simply continuing the development. We're trying to pinpoint the drawback of the bishop being on e7, and that is that the queen does not have access to that square. And this is illustrated in the following line. Let's say black could follow suit, rook c8, now we go bishop a6, rook moves, and queen e2. And now you see the difference. White's queen is safe on e2, yeah, as the rooks can comfortably take control over the central files, whereas the black queen cannot access the e7 square because the bishop is there. Yeah. So white's plan now is rook fd1, but don't forget that advance of the e-pawn. We haven't abandoned it just yet because the queen from e2 also supports the e4 push. Yeah. And again, some slight initiative for white in this position. So that's the move knight bd7, preparing c5, and also there is a c5 immediately. Total symmetry. You can expect to get this position, yeah, from probably less experienced players. You already know how to react by now. Rule of thumb, when these 4 pawns facing each other, take on d5. Yeah. By now, I'm pretty sure you know the scenarios. Black recaptures with a piece, black recaptures with a pawn. In case of recapturing with a pawn, we go knight c3, and then the automatic more or less play rook c1, rook e1, bishop f1, g3, and bishop g2. Explained more than once, the bishop is securing the king side, and in the future potentially targeting this pawn on d5. It's better for black to recapture with a piece. Yeah, and now the simplest way is to resolve the tension in the center and capture on c5. It's possible to go knight d2 and then take on c5, but let's just keep it simple. Take on c5 and keep the long diagonal open. Black should recapture with the bishop because bc5, knight bd2 just saddles black with a isolated pawn on c5, a weakness, a lone pawn with no compensation that white can simply start attacking with queen c2, rook c1. Yeah, the knight can attack from e4. So it's not a good decision for black. So bishop takes e5, and now knight bd2. Yeah. And we reach this position which I mentioned a bit earlier. Yeah. The knight from d2. It's possible to develop to c3, but to d2 is a bit more, let's say, ambitious, as it keeps more pieces on the board, as the knight can come to c4 or e4 to attack that bishop on c5. And other ideas for white is the advance on the queen side, a3, b4, attacking that bishop on c5. If white manages that, the queen can then safely come to the b3 square, freeing the d1 square for the king's rook. The other rook will come to the c file, occupying both central open files. What is important to know in this position is that you shouldn't really be afraid of a possible sacrifice on e3. It may look a bit scary, but the point is that after f takes e3, knight takes e3, queen e1, knight takes f1, and bishop f1. In fact, in this position, white's bishop and knight are worth more than a rook and two pawns. Yeah, because the rooks are very passive. They are not involved in the play, and the pawns cannot really advance. Whereas white's pieces are all very well developed, and white can use them to start play on the king side with a move like, let's say, knight e4, queen g3, threatening mate on g7. Yeah, maybe rook will come to d1, the knight can land on d6, and so forth, when all the pieces are actually very active, and this would be a bad decision for black to go for this position. So that wraps up our analysis of the chapter, first chapter in this course, Black Plays First Move d5. Well, I hope you enjoyed it and learned how to play when black goes d5 on move 1. I tried to explain the main ideas, the rules of thumb, pointing out when they are applicable, also pointing out all these move transpositions, which shouldn't really bother you because basically white always plays more or less in the same way. So thanks for watching this first chapter, and now it's time to move on to the next one. I'll see you there.